If you're married or hope to be married someday, let me offer you a piece of marital advice. It is neither proper nor prudent to air your marital problems in public. Likewise, it's never appropriate to publicly discuss your spouse's character flaws or failures. Trust me, this is sound advice. I've been married for a long time, and I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. More mistakes than I care to mention or even remember. If you happen to be familiar with my marriage, you know that my wife and I have had many ups and downs over the years. We've had moments on the high mountaintops, but we've also walked through some dark valleys. We've known poverty and plenty, fear and faith, joy and sorrow. We've had our fair share of fights and arguments like everybody else, but so far, we've survived. If you know my wife in particular, you know that she's extremely beautiful and talented. But she can also be contentious at times. My advice is that whatever you do, don't ever cross her. Trust me, whatever you do, stay on her good side. Well, now that I've broken my own marital advice, and let me make another mistake by sharing with you a story about one of my wife's failures. Let me tell you about the time that my wife lied to the Lord. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a sizzling summer day where the sun was so intense that you could see the heat waves rising up from the sand and fading into a translucent haze. It was one of those days when the air was so thick that you couldn't even work outside. It was too heavy to work indoors. You couldn't really do anything except maybe wade in the river. But to be honest with you, even the water in the river was so warm that it wasn't refreshing. And so you had a choice to make, either to sit and bake or to be in the water and boil. Neither was a good decision. In my opinion, the only thing you can do on a day like this is to find a big old oak tree with leaves falling all around and sit underneath it in the shade and pray for God to send a cool breeze down from heaven. Well, that's exactly what I was doing. Sitting under the oak tree before my eyes grew dim and my mind faded off to midday dreamland. It felt like I'd only been asleep for a few minutes, but as soon as I awoke, the long shadows on the ground told me that I had been out for a couple of hours. I was resting peacefully until I heard footsteps encroaching and the sound of muffled voices. I thought it must have been my teenage son, 13 years old. Isn't it amazing how teenagers thump louder than horses' hooves when they walk? But by the time I wiped the pools of sweat from underneath my eyes, I glanced up and saw 3 strange men standing before me. At first, they had the look of ordinary men, and I could tell by their sun-kissed faces, their long beards, and the smell of a long journey on their cloaks, that they were ordinary travelers. But there was something about the peacefulness of their presence that told me that these men were anything but ordinary. Somehow my spirit within me knew that these were not mortal men, but these were messengers of the Most High God. I got up as quickly as these old bones could move, and I bowed myself to the ground in a gesture of respect and hospitality. I said, my name is Abraham, and welcome to my tent. They didn't speak any words, and I offered them a glass of water. I said, please come and sit in my tent. Let me get you something to drink. And they nodded in agreement and came and sat down before me. I rushed over to the well to get a pail of cool water. And when I brought it back, they gulped that whole pail of water faster than a camel that had just crossed the desert. I kept wondering why these visitors from heaven came to me, especially now. I couldn't make any sense of it, but it didn't seem right to ask any questions. As I watched them wipe the grime from their face and the dust from their feet, I thought to myself, there's something I have to do to serve my Lord. And I didn't want it to be something simple, like giving them a pail of water to drink. I wanted it to be something spectacular. What could I do to offer my Lord who was there in my midst? I thought for a long time, and the only thing that I could think to offer them was to stay for dinner that evening. And so I asked them, I said, my Lord, please don't pass me by. Would you be willing to stay and rest in my tent and share a meal with me this evening? And they all nodded in agreement. And I said, please rest for a while and let me go and make preparations. And so I watched them take the sandals off their feet and lay their bodies down in the tent to rest. They looked exhausted. And I rushed off to my wife's tent, and I ran in and said, Sarah, what are we planning for dinner tonight? And then she looked at me casually and said, leftovers. And I thought, oh no, I can't offer my Lord leftovers. I wanted it to be something special. I wanted to give him a feast, not a mere morsel of bread. And I said, Sarah, is there any way that you could bake some fresh bread for me? And she said, why? What's wrong with leftovers? She cocked her head and put her hands on her hip and gave me that look like, what's wrong with leftovers? And I said, no, you don't understand. We just have 3 guests that arrived at my tent, unexpected, and I want to put on a good meal for them. And she said, oh, I see. You want me to bake fresh bread for you. And I said, please, princess, wouldn't you do it just for me? And then I said, could you get 5 gallons of our best flour and bake as many loaves as you can? And she said, 5 gallons? What are you trying to feed, an army? Who are these guests, and to what do we owe this pleasure? And I said, I'm so sorry, I can't explain it all right now. I have to run to the butcher to get some meat. I'll explain it all later. And that's when she looked at me and said, why are you always so impatient? And I thought to myself, me impatient? Isn't that the pot calling the kettle black? But I didn't have time for a marital spat, and so I just walked away. From then, I went over to the butcher and I ordered the fatted calf, and I asked him to slaughter it and roast it as quickly as he could and bring it to my tent when it was ready. After I left the butcher, I dashed over to the creamery and got some pails of milk and some yogurt to share with my guests. And by the time I got back to my tent, the roasted calf had arrived, and Sarah was there with the loaves of bread in a basket ready to share. And I sat there with those 3 guests and shared a wonderful meal together. It was as if these men had never eaten human food before. For there was the feast of veal cutlets, fresh baked bread, and spiced yogurt, and goat's milk. And they savored each bite and appreciated the culinary art that they were experiencing. After they had finished the meal and their bellies were full, they had the glow of gratitude and contentment on their faces. And that's when I realized that my service really was acceptable. I wanted to do something spectacular to serve the Lord. But I learned in that moment that simple hospitality, offering someone a cold cup of water on a hot day, a warm, well-cooked meal for a hungry belly, or offering someone a mat and a pillow to rest their weary head, that these were actually profound ways to serve others. How do you serve others? Do you offer them hospitality? Our gifts to others and to the Lord don't have to be extravagant, but simple things just like this. For I saw that look of contentment on the Lord's face, and I knew that I had served him well. All the time that we were eating, I kept wondering, what was the purpose of this divine appointment with the Lord? Why did he and these two angels show up at my tent? There must be some reason. And that's when he looked over at me and said, Abraham, at this time next year, I am going to return. And when I do, you will have a son. And I thought, oh, this is why the Lord had appeared to me. For he had already told me sometime before that he was going to give me a son by my wife Sarah. But I didn't know when it was going to happen. And that the Lord himself would show up personally with his presence in some sort of mystical form in the flesh to share this message with me. I knew that he loved me and cared for me, and he wanted to do this personally. After he shared that message with me, he asked the question and said, where is your wife Sarah? And at first I almost asked him the question, how did you know that my wife's name was... But then I realized he's the Lord. He knows everything. As a matter of fact, he's the one that changed her name to Sarah. But then I thought, if he knows my wife's name, why did he ask me where she was? And just as I was beginning to put all of this together, he asked the question, why did your wife Sarah laugh when I said that you were going to have a son this time next year? I didn't know Sarah had laughed, but evidently, as he was explaining that nothing is too difficult for the Lord, she had come right to the outside edge of the tent and was listening in to our conversation. He knew that she was there the whole time, even though I didn't. And when he asked me, why did she laugh? I thought, well, I'm not sure. And just as he was beginning to explain that nothing is too difficult for the Lord, that his plans cannot be thwarted by age or barrenness or anything else, that he is almighty, that he has power to do anything, even to make a 90-year-old woman have a child, Sarah walked in right in that moment. We all looked at her, and once again he asked, why did you laugh? And I could tell by Sarah's face that she was immediately convicted. But she put on the charm and smiled that cute little smile she has, and she said, oh, you must be mistaken. I didn't laugh. I could see that her smile was a thin disguise to cover up her lying eyes, and that even the best of charm wasn't going to fool the Lord. For even as she lied right to the Lord's face, he and the two angels gazed into her eyes. They stared her down. And then finally he said, yes, you did laugh. And in that moment, her eyes burst into tears, became a fountain of flowing water running down her face, and she fled the tent. She was too embarrassed to even stay. As I beheld this whole spectacle, I was half embarrassed. I didn't know what to say or what to do. But that's when the Lord rose right before me and said, Abraham, you need to go and tend to your wife. After all, it's time for my messengers and I to leave your tent, for we have some business to pursue down in the city of Sodom. And so they turned southward and began to walk away. As I watched their backs fade into the falling sun, I thought to myself, why did Sarah lie? Why did she do this? But as I thought about it, I understood. She panicked in the moment and didn't know what to do. She tried to save face, as she knew she was guilty of laughing, that she didn't believe what the Lord had said. And she felt embarrassed. This is exactly how I felt many years ago when I actually lied to the Pharaoh of Egypt. I asked Sarah to lie because I was afraid that he would take my life if he found out that I was her husband. Fear drives falsehood. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever felt like you were backed into a corner, taken off guard, and you didn't know what to say in the moment, and so you lied? Have you ever lied to try to cover up a precarious position that you were in? You tried to avoid exposing yourself or embarrassment or humiliation. And so you thought right in that moment that it would just be simply better to lie, not to have to deal with it. Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever had the experience where you got caught in a lie? Do you remember that cold chill running down your spine? That pit in your stomach when you knew that your secret was exposed? The stress and anxiety of getting caught in a lie is never worth it. And so take it from me and from my wife, Sarah. Always tell the truth, even when it costs. For after all, even if we fool the person that we're lying to, sometime down the road, they're often able to figure it out, and the lie gets exposed. And even if it doesn't, the Lord always knows. He knows everything. We cannot deceive him. He sees and knows every cheap trick that we've ever done. And so, I hope that you'll learn from my and my wife's mistake and always tell the truth. This whole event happened a number of years ago, and as I continue to reflect on it even today, I'm reminded of what I learned about God's presence that day. That here was the presence of the Lord that showed up right when I needed him the most. I was about to turn 100 years old, and I had wondered about God's promise that he made to me so many years ago. For 24 years ago, I heard God's voice speak to me. And when he called me out of Ur of the Chaldeans and called me to follow him to the promised land. And when I was 86 years old, God appeared to me in a vision and showed me the stars in the night sky and said, "So will your offspring be." I had heard God's voice. I had heard him communicate in a vision, and now I had seen the physical presence of the Lord. He showed up at the exact right time, in the exact right way, to give me the assurance that I needed. That's the interesting thing about God's presence. He always knows when we need him the most, and he gives us the exact form of his presence that we need. Are you going through something in your life today? Do you need a measure of God's presence? don't fear. He will come to you in the way and in the time that you need. I also learned something about God's power that day. As I was sitting in the tent and I listened to him say, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" I already knew the answer to that question. But when he asked it, it became real in a way that I had never felt before. And I thought to myself that if God is the one who created the heavens and the earth, put those very stars in the sky, if he is the one that sculpted human beings out of the dust of the earth, certainly he can cause an old man and a barren woman to conceive and give birth to a child. Why would we think that this was too impossible for the Lord? Why would we ever doubt his word or his promises? For he is almighty and he has the power to do anything. And let me just say this to you, that if God can give me a son at the age of 100 and cause my wife to give birth at age 90, long past the age of childbearing, then certainly he can overcome your problems, no matter how difficult they seem. Well, as I mentioned before, I learned a lot about that time my wife lied to the Lord. And I hope that you will learn a lot too. May God's blessing be with you all this day.
Thank you, Abraham. I didn't know he was going to be here. I'm going to be reading to you Genesis 18, verse 1 through 15. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, "O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that, then you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time that was appointed by me, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh."